Hello, everyone. It is Lloyd May here again with the final mini lecture of the workshop. And today we'll be talking about aesthetic accessibility. So, in his book Broken Beauty, Joseph Strauss explains this concept a little bit. But aesthetic accessibility is how many people can relate to an object or a piece of work in an aesthetic way that the designer intended. So don't worry, we'll get into some examples to unpack that. But this is just to say that in Broken Beauty, Joseph Strauss looks at 12-tone serialist music, which is a genre of music that is atonal, so it tries to treat all 12 notes in the Western equal-tempered tuning system as the same and as equal. And Strauss argues in this book that it was an attempt, although a flawed one, at aesthetic accessibility in that by democratizing these notes, it became easier to subvert this idea of a normal. And it had a very real ramification that folks with less fine motor skills and things like that could, in theory, play some of this 12-tone music if, all the notes were equal. But yeah, so it's a great book and very nuanced. I highly encourage it if you're looking to get into it. But so we'll start just with some broad aesthetic considerations when thinking about designing something that is aesthetically accessible. Because, for example, if we imagine designing a piece of assistive tech, let's say a wheelchair, it can have all the functionality in the world, but if it looks scary and really complicated, we're probably not going to get a lot of people to use it. And sadly, that is the case in many instruments. So some aesthetic considerations is we're always looking to find the sweet spot of familiarity and novelty. If something is completely novel and foreign and we don't have a touchstone or a reference for it, it can be very intimidating to interact with, unless folks have a very high tolerance for novelty. And at the same time, if something is too familiar, it just becomes boring. So this is something you hear pop producers talk about, and in a bunch of domains, trying to leverage familiarity in a way to introduce people to your new thing is normally an interesting design approach. The second one is obvious legibility. And so this doesn't necessarily mean that every part of your work or instrument has to be legible, which means that your users can understand what's going on pretty easily. But it should be clear to your users which parts of it should be legible. So for example, if there is some, complicated neural net machine learning stuff going on and that's put just in a black box somewhere, that's generally a good communication to the user that, oh, this is a complicated thing that doesn't have to be legible to you. Don't worry about it. So it's not to say that every part of your project has to be perfectly legible, but it should be obvious which parts should and shouldn't be legible. And the last one is just a common design mantra: polish brings good faith. So especially in the prototypes, don't worry too much about this, but thinking forward, when things feel polished, or what we might call just feel intentionally designed, all the little details are thought about, the fonts are aligned, things like that. There's no clipping in the sound design. That generally encourages users to interact with something in a way that brings more what we might call good faith. So again, might increase this appetite for novelty. So those are just three considerations that we'd like you to think about when approaching your project. Is how can you balance familiarity, obvious legibility, and polish in your project. And also totally okay, like we said, for a prototype to not be polished, just for you to think about going forward. So this brings us to the topic of what we call pyramid design. Where do people get on and get off on an experience aesthetically? So they might be drawn in these pyramid diagrams. So in this diagram, we have a 4-tiered pyramid, and the base of each section of the pyramid represents approximately the percentage of your audience having that aesthetic experience. And the y-axis is the different aesthetic experiences of your object. And, to clarify, real people don't follow diagrams. They jump around the pyramid and everything. So this is just a helpful way to think about design, but, with the acknowledgement that real people are messy and confusing. So it's maybe best understood with an example. So if we take the children's movie Shrek, for example, the most common aesthetic experience might be an interaction with the fun shapes and sounds presented by the movie. The voice acting, the animation of the green ogre, etc. That even, you might postulate that 2 or 3 year olds could have a fun time engaging with, right up to, adults and animation professors would still enjoy the fun shapes and sounds. And then you have the narrative, which is maybe only accessible to folks who speak the language and have the cognitive capacity to hold all those things in working memory, to connect them. Then you could have the jokes that are often more for the older audience, the parents watching the movies, that are sprinkled in. And then right at the top, you have, something like really niche, like the texturing of the mud that the animation team spent a long time on that, only 2 people in the audience are going to notice, but they're going to really appreciate it. So this is just to say that the majority of your audience was going to spend time on the lowest tier, the thing that brings them all in. And it is very tempting for designers to try spend a lot of time at the top, because that's where the fun technical things are. But it's always good to remember the percentage of people that are going to spend time with the different aesthetic components that you're working on. So if we compare that with something like Giant Steps, which is a song from a jazz legend, John Coltrane, we might see a very big broad bass, which is the aesthetic of virtuosity, like it's a fast song. These are clearly skilled musicians performing this. And then we might see a very big break off to folks only who are pretty into jazz, who realize the dense harmonies going on and how it's breaking with jazz tradition. And then even a smaller fraction of them are maybe understanding some of the musical references being used in Giant Steps. And then who knows, maybe only John Coltrane is the person who could see the final aesthetic vision of Giant Steps. But this is just to see that how different, for example, something like Shrek and Giant Steps views aesthetic accessibility. And so some things to chew on thinking about aesthetic accessibility going forward is, are you spending time on the thing that the most people will interact with? Or are you getting lost in sort of technical weeds? And then refining that even more, is your core interaction good? And have you nailed the basics? If you're building a physical object, is it a fun and enjoyable thing to hold, to interact with? And similar, if you're doing website or digital things, is it a good virtual space to be? It's as we think about interaction and all the more complicated mappings and musical things that build on top of that, we ask that you don't lose sight of these basics that can sometimes be very easily overlooked. Alrighty, so that is the end of the lecture. And as always, please feel free to reach out to me or Doa if you have any questions. And looking forward to seeing your guys' projects evolve. Alrighty, bye-bye.